What's good, YouTube? I thought I'd jump on this morning and do a quick little tier list for all of the meta specs in Season 1 in Dragonflight. I'm briefly going to go over each of these specs and talk about why they deserve their spot in the meta, from their damage to their utility or their healing. And then at the end of the video, we'll touch on whether I can see these specs continuing to be meta in the next season. So to kick things off then, we'll start with the tanks. I'm sure it's no surprise to you guys that we're going to whack Paladin straight in the meta AF tier. Prot Paladins have ended up as an absolute monster in this season. They didn't start off too hot. A lot of the focus was on Prot Warriors, and for good reason as well. They are definitely a very strong tank as well, but towards the end, Paladin did just overtake them through the consistent buffs they were getting throughout the season, and that has now solidified them as definitely the meta tank. I think a big reason for this was how the Prot Paladin scaled into higher keys. It was just able to mitigate more damage and deal with the damage better that they were taking than other classes, for example the Prot Warrior. Also, it's no secret that they have insane off heals. This is the whole reason pretty much that we've seen these 4 DPS and 1 tank dungeons. I'm sure we've all seen this season that some of the highest dungeons that we've seen cleared have been with 4 DPS and 1 tank, and it's not just through the Paladin, but I would contribute a big portion to why that is actually viable towards the Prot Paladin. They just have ridiculous off heals with their Word of Glory, ridiculous self-sustain as well, so they can keep themselves up while taking care of the rest of the group as well. For a tank as well, they have some pretty nutty AoE burst, which allows them obviously to generate all the threat, get control of all the mobs, but they also just continue to pump out AoE DPS. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think towards the end of the season as well, that their single target actually got a slight buff as well. So they're not lacking too much in that department either. The Paladin class in general has pretty unmatched utility for the group as well, specifically in a Mythic Plus setting. We've obviously got the combat res now that we got going into Dragonflight, so that is huge, especially for a group comp that lacks a combat res. They got Blessing of Protection, which is great for some bosses. I'm thinking Fenrir in Halls of Valor, or even just to help classes out that generate a lot of aggro at the start of pulls. They got the Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Freedom, all of that good stuff. Like, you really just cannot match the Prot Paladin, especially for utility out of all the tanks. So it is a clear winner pretty much all around for the Prot Paladin. For the healer meta, we have another class that changed towards the end of the season as well. So we're going to go with the Resto Druid. For a big chunk of the season, it was the Preservation Evoker, but Resto Druid was always up there as well. I think it was more so just because of the front-loaded damage from the Evoker, and also the fact that it brought Bloodlust. But Resto Druids have some insane healing throughput. As long as you know the damage is coming, you can be proactive and pretty much take care of your group in any situation. They also pump out some great damage through Nature's Vigil and also the dots, Sunfire and Moonfire, and then whenever they can and feel the need to, they can drop down into cat form and start cat weaving and putting out some DPS with that. Being a druid class as well, they have some of the best utility in the game. You've got the Mark of the Wild buff that you bring to the group, which is just 3% flat verse for your whole team. Very nice for just decreasing the overall damage that you take throughout the key, but also adding a little bit of damage here and there as well. You have utility to help out your tank or group if needs be, so you've got your Ursol's Vortex, you've got Typhoon, you've got Roots if you need to root anything. You can go for an in-cap broad to AoE CC packs if you need to mass AoE interrupt. As a Resto Druid, you really can just contribute a lot of help to your group outside of just pure healing, and you also have a very strong external for your tank in the form of Ironbark. It is also a pretty big challenge to die on the Druid as well. If you ever feel in danger, just drop down into bear form, get the extra stamina, the extra armor. Outside of that, you have your heals for yourself and also Bark Skin on a short cooldown, which is going to help reduce any incoming damage, and you can pretty much do that on a pack-to-pack basis as well. So that is it for the tank and healer meta. Like I said, Prot Warrior was definitely a strong contender for the meta up until the end of the season pretty much. And as far as healer alternatives go, Preservation Evoker is still definitely a strong pick, and also Resto Shaman is kind of making a come up at the end of the season as well, although I do think just generally the Resto Druid is a better pick. As far as DPS meta goes then, we're going to start with, if you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button, the Balance Druid. No surprises here, I'm sure. Balance is probably one of the best AoE DPS in the game at the moment, specifically in a Mythic Plus setting. They have damage for every single pack with their Pulsar procs, and it is also sustained AoE DPS as well, so in those higher keys, the damage doesn't fall off. It just ramps high and then stays high. They do lack a little bit more on the single single target department, but as the bosses don't last too long in a Mythic Plus scenario, you can keep yourself up there towards the top of the DPS meters, just being carried from the burst at the start of the fight when you have your cooldowns or your pulsar procs. They also boast great priority damage with their Star Weaver talent. Whenever they're star falling, they have a chance to proc a free star surge, which you can just dump into your prio target to chunk them down even further. So yeah, balance is definitely one to contend with on the top of the overall meters at the end of the dungeon. It does pump out some ridiculous damage at the moment. This helps with their off heals as well through Nature's Vigil. It is only single target damage, but when you've got a big pack and you're blasting out those free star surges, and also I believe the Moonfires and Sunfires count when they're ticking on the mobs, as some extra healing throughput through Nature's Vigil. Like I said, for the Resto Druid, Druids in general just have probably some of the best utility in the game. You've got the Mark of the Wild buff if you don't already have a Resto Druid. You got Vortex, Typhoon, Incap Roar, Solar Beam as well, which is very unique to balance in the form of an AoE silence. You can take trees if you need it, but we haven't really seen much play of them this season. I don't think tanks have really needed them, but the option is always there. Again, for the Druid class in general, a very, very tanky class. Drop into bear form whenever you need to. Bark Skin on a 1 minute cooldown. You've got well-honed instincts, which is going to top you up if you ever get low, and also an instant heal in renewal. It's pretty hard to die on this class. Next, we'll go with another very strong range class in Shadow Priest. Again, not a surprise, I'm sure. With this class, you've got damage for every pack. You've got your Shadow Crash, getting all your dots out very quickly, helping out with the ramp time that Shadow Priest has always been not ideal with. You got great AoE damage, decent single target, and a lot of your damage is actually contributed from your power infusion. The damage this ability brings to your group throughout the course of a dungeon is stupid, and if it actually counted as the Shadow Priest damage, they would be top of the overalls every single dungeon, no questions asked. Shadow Priest is another culprit in the 4 DPS 1 tank meta at the moment, if you want to call it a meta. They really do have insane off heals with Vampiric Embrace, especially on big packs with their cooldowns, so that definitely helps solidify them as a pick in a meta. You probably would either go with a Balanced Druid or a Shadow Priest. You can't really take both in those hierarchies just because of the lack of interrupts, in all honesty. Balanced Druid has a very strong interrupt in certain scenarios, but outside of that, you've got an interrupt on a 1 minute or 45-second cooldown. Same goes for the Shadow Priest, but it's a single target interrupt, or a silence, I should say. So you can't really have them both together, but picking either one, you can't go wrong here. They are incredibly strong classes. The Shadow Priest has also got amazing utility as well. Mass Dispel, you've got Mind Soothe as well if you need to skip any packs, or if you don't want to ninja pull a patrolling pack that's moving in. You've got Life Grip if your tank needs it, or you need to pull your DPS out of something that they're not looking at. And also, obviously, you've got a stamina buff as well, which can be pretty huge, especially on tyrannical bosses. Next, we're going to go with the Subtlety Rogue. Rogue's always in the bloody meta, isn't it? But this time it's Subtlety. This rogue spec definitely has the best AoE out of all the rogue specs, specifically in mass AoE, which is also coupled very nicely with the Storm Eater's boon. I would argue that Rogue is probably one of the only classes that can realistically get away with using this trinket because they can pair Cloak of Shadows with it. This trinket really can be a death sentence, especially in high keys, but the Rogue does negate that by having their Cloak of Shadows, which is just going to add to their massive AoE already. They have great single target damage, and also Subtlety is obviously known for its funnel damage. However, when you are funneling as a Subtlety Rogue, you do lose all of your AoE pretty much. So in my opinion, there are better funnel classes out there that can still do big AoE at the same time, but if you need to burst down a prio target, if it's going to kill your group or something like that, then you can just send your rogue to send the eviscerates on the main target, get it down, while the rest of your group take cares of the rest of the pack. As we all know, Rogue has probably the best control in the game of mobs. You got your stuns, your kick, blind, sap, all the works. As a Subtlety Rogue specifically, you can pretty much, I think, triple cheap shot, because you can take a talent that makes cheap shot free. So arguably, it's probably the best at stopping abilities from mobs out of the rogue specs. I'd say it probably used to be outlaw when gouge was specific to outlaw, but now you can take that in any rogue spec, so that's a W for all the rogue specs. You've got even more utility in the form of tricks if you need to snap anything to your tank for threat. You've got Shroud, which opens up a lot of routing options in your dungeons. This helps with getting Bloodlust on cooldown quicker for dangerous packs or dangerous bosses. You've also got Sap as well, which is one of the few abilities in the game that does actually let you skip a mob. If you sap the mob, the rest of your group can run past them safely and not get in combat with them. So as always, one rogue spec has got to be in the meta. And although I only put one of each for the tank and healer, I do want to add some more DPS classes just for the variety of comps that you can see, and these other classes definitely do deserve their spot in the meta as well. First, I want to go with a Havoc Demon Hunter. I've always said that this spec is pretty much designed for Mythic Plus and Vengeance as well. This class has insane burst in all scenarios, specifically in cleave. Like, the cleave damage from Havoc is just nuts at this point, but it also performs very well in large AoE as well. They're a very passively tanky class as well through the talents they can take in their general tree, just reducing magic damage taken by a flat amount. You've got AoE stops through Chaos Nova. You've got Sigil of Misery, which can also increase the damage you do to these targets as well. You've got single target stops in Fell Eruption. Imprison is another one of those abilities that allows your group to safely skip mobs without getting in combat. And obviously, you also have Chaos Brand for any casters in your group. Your Shadow Priests and Boomkins will be loving you. Havoc is a true monster this season. It is just quite a hard spec to pull off with the momentum-based playstyle. I mean, to me, it almost feels like an extra affix at this point, having to zip around to keep up your momentum buff to deal extra damage. But if played well, this spec is definitely a meta spec. Another melee DPS that I'm sure you guys have been waiting for, Enhancement Shaman. Now, this spec in the meta is unique in the fact that it is probably one of the only ones that brings Bloodlust to your group. It obviously used to be the Preservation Evoker, but now it is the Enhancement Shaman that fills that void. This spec has amazing single target damage as well as priority damage, and with that priority damage that they do bring, you can also perform very well in a cleave scenario. Another culprit in the 4 DPS 1 tank meta. The off heals with Ancestral Guidance is just bonkers. Like, if you have one of these as Shadow Priest in your group, you can just pretty much take care of your group at all times. It's ridiculous. And also, I'd say something that massively plays into their favor as well is they have a lot of AoE stops. So you have your Capacitor Totem, you have Sundering, which is sort of part of your rotation, but ideally you probably save that for the AoE stop at the same time. You have Thunder Shock, I think it's called, where you're going to knock mobs up and interrupt all their casts. And being a shaman, you have the shortest kick in the game, so you have a lot of stops that you bring as an enhancement shaman specifically. The only problem with this spec is they are quite squishy, but out of the specs in this meta, they are probably one of the only squishy classes, so they can be babied a bit by the other classes in your group, and obviously you have a lot of off heals that you can top yourself up with as well, as long as you don't get one shot. The final class I want to put into this meta tier list, it made a little rise at the end, and it has been pumping its little socks off. It's had a massive rework. Can you tell what it is yet? It's the Ret Paladin. Ret has a very desirable damage profile for Mythic Plus. They have literally a 1-minute damage profile, and it is ridiculously bursty, especially in AoE. It's pretty hard to keep up with a Ret Paladin these days in an AoE scenario. They just walk in, 5 globals, the pack's dead, they're on 500k DPS, job's a good one. They also boast some respectable single target damage as well for your bosses. They have AoE stuns, they've got Blinding Light for another AoE stop as well. You've got cleanses for your group, you have a ton of off healing, though you do sacrifice quite a bit of DPS for it. You have a combat res, like I mentioned, for the prop paladin, and also Retribution Aura is pretty massive now. Whenever somebody in your group takes 30% damage or more, which is quite frequent in Mythic Plus, your party is going to get a damage buff, so that works very nicely for the group, and over the course of the dungeon probably adds up to quite a lot of damage. So I would say these are the specs that we would rate as meta in the Season 1 of Dragonflight. They all have great damage in pretty much all scenarios, even the tanks and healers as well. They're all pretty tanky and can generally take care of themselves. Sorry, enhancement shamans. They boast some of the best utility in the game, which is very nice and needed for Mythic Plus. But as we know, damage is not the be-all, end-all of Mythic Plus. Obviously, these meta specs do need to do a lot of damage to be considered meta, but there are specs down below that do a lot more damage, but just simply don't bring enough utility to warrant them as a meta spec for this season. And I think in regards to next season, we will probably see quite a few of these classes stay in the meta tier. I'm looking at Prop Paladins. Prop Paladins still seeming very strong going into next season. Resto Druid as well. I'm not sure if their tier set has been nerfed yet, because it definitely seemed very strong when I first read it. I haven't been keeping too much up to date with how the healers tier sets are being balanced at the moment, but Resto Druid is definitely a strong contender for next season as well. Balanced Druid, from what I've seen on the PTR, is doing very respectable numbers. The tier set is catered more towards Mythic Plus and AoE, so you're getting a lot of value from those crashing stars in a Mythic Plus scenario. as well as the Moonfire and Sunfire damage, but they're probably still going to struggle on single target. So those tyrannical weeks on those bosses, they might struggle on those weeks, but we will have to see. Shadow Priest is looking very strong at the moment for next season. They are AoE demons. Can't really say the same for single target. However, from the amount of AoE they're doing and the PI they bring, they are on top form at the moment. So we'll see how that ends up. Rogue, whether it's Sub Rogue or whether it's Outlaw Rogue, sorry, Asa Rogues, it's either going to be probably one of the two. Outlaws tier looks very strong for next season with the Soul Rip Dam, but also Subs looks pretty strong as well. So it's going to be a toss-up right there. Havoc, again, looking very strong for next season too. They don't have the most interesting tier set in the world, but it is going to be some nice extra damage. Whether they play around it or not, they're not going to, spoiler alert. It's just going to add some overall damage to them and hopefully help out their single target a bit, which they definitely do need out of all their damage profiles. Enhancement's a bit of a tricky one. From what I've seen on the PTR testing so far, it seems like if you get the right procs with enhancement, which has always been the case, but I think it's just been exaggerated for next tier, they are doing ridiculous damage, like almost double any other class's burst I've seen. But if you don't get the procs, then it's unfortunate and you're doing tank damage. There's definitely going to be a lot of tuning going on with not just this, not just the enhancement, but all classes in general. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But I do think enhancement needs a little bit more looking at than other classes. But their tier set after the buffs does seem strong for Mythic Plus. It's going to be some big Chain Lightning dam and also some big physical and fire dam. Ret Paladin doesn't have the most exciting tier set in the world, but I think they are just a force to be reckoned with at the moment. They are pumping out some stupid numbers and it doesn't look like they're slowing down anytime soon. With the AoE execute from the Hammer of Wrath and also that applying Judgment, that's obviously going to scale their damage quite nicely, specifically in execute windows, though they're not too long in Mythic Plus. Obviously the mobs aren't going to be up for 2-3 minutes when they hit 30%, so, or 20%? I don't know what it even is. Is it 20 or 30? Let me know down in the comments. So yeah, they're all looking pretty strong for next tier as well. There are a few down below that I've got my eye on, but there is going to be another video coming soon about my DPS meta predictions for next season as well, so keep an eye out for that. Leave a like down below if you enjoyed the video and also comment on what you thought the meta was, if I got it wrong, and also what you think is going to be the meta for next season. Let me know down below. Subscribe to your boy if you haven't already, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.